Well, welcome everyone. Let me give you a very warm welcome indeed to a new semester of Social Contract Research Network seminars. Today's approach is from literary studies. It is a disciplinary approach that I fear we have all too infrequently used in this series. And so I'm particularly delighted to be able to welcome our guest speaker and introduce the topic for this session. There will be, as usual, a time of discussion at the end. Please would you store up any questions that you have and just say in the chat function on Zoom that you have a question, and then I'll call on people in the order that you put those questions in the chat. Well, it is my great delight to be able to welcome Dr. Kristine Moruzi, Associate Professor from the School of Communication and Creative Arts at Deakin University here in Australia, and indeed here in Melbourne, from where I speak as well. And Kristine's title for this seminar is Children's Periodicals and the Common Good, the Charitable Child. So would you please join with me in welcoming our speaker for this session, Kristine Moruzi.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me this evening or in the morning, depending on your time. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm located today. I want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. So I will share my slides here. I did think that perhaps some of the audience would not be that familiar with children's periodicals, so it was kind of helpful to have a few images to share, just so that you had a bit of a sense for the kinds of materials that I've spent quite a long time looking at. And I think in general, perhaps my papers will be less philosophically inclined. I think it's more sort of embedded in the ideas that I'm discussing with respect to how charity and children were promulgated in the 19th century. So I'll just get started. The 1889 volume of the Band of Hope Review contains a story entitled Cyril's Sacrifice, where 12-year-old Cyril laments that his father will not be able to make his annual Christmas contribution to the orphan asylum. Cyril has no money of his own, for he always spends it as soon as it arrives. The only item of value that he owns is a beautiful model man-of-war ship that he has spent the last 2 years building. He decides to sell the ship, and with the money from the sale, orders oranges and apples and toys to be shared with the orphan children. Cyril's willingness to part with his ship inspires the man who purchased it to return it to the boy in recognition of his self-denying kindness. The accompanying illustration of a ship laden with fruit and the headmistress distributing toys to the young orphans in the foreground, together with the story that accompanies it, operate together to reflect the dynamic relationship between the child as charitable donor and the child as object of charity that is emblematic of charitable relations in the 19th century. Although the story highlights Cyril's sacrifice and the important work he performs to enable the orphans to receive their Christmas treat, the illustration is designed to encourage viewers to imagine the happiness of the young people receiving their gifts. The Band of Hope Review, which was a temperance periodical, is one of many children's periodicals published in the 19th century that aimed to instruct young readers about specific charitable causes and how they could help others in need. The illustration focuses readerly attention on the children in need of assistance, but the accompanying narrative instructs children on the sacrifices that they should make to help others. While the narrator is sympathetic to Cyril's dilemma, readers are reminded that a sacrifice which costs nothing is generally worth nothing. The value of Cyril's charitable work comes from the sacrifice he willingly makes to give the children a happy celebration. This example is emblematic of the reciprocal giving that is defined and reinforced through children's periodicals in the 19th century. The period between 1840 and 1900 is characterized by the expansion of periodicals for young people and concomitant concerns about the appropriate reading for a young audience. The reduction in paper prices around 1850 in England meant that the number of periodicals expanded rapidly in the second half of the century. Magazines became more affordable, and children were seen as an emerging market. At the same time, with the publication of cheap magazines containing stories of crime and intrigue, adults became increasingly concerned about what children of all classes were reading and whether it was appropriate for a young audience. The 19th century is also a key period for understanding the rise of charity. Alan Kidd explains how, quote, the social fabric of Victorian England was permeated by charity and repercussions of the charitable relationship. Directly or indirectly, philanthropy affected the social and cultural life of the time. Although debates about the appropriate form of charity persisted throughout the century, with some arguing for a tax-supported system of relief, while others felt that individual charity was more appropriate, rapid industrialization and urbanization meant cities were flooded with new inhabitants living in extremely marginal conditions. This new class of poor was a concern because it signaled social instability, declining health, and inadequate social policy. At the same time, childhood as a period of innocence and vulnerability was an important development of the 19th century that prompted legislation to protect child workers and provided mandatory education. Yet social welfare programs were virtually non-existent, and poor and neglected children had little recourse except for the streets. Charitable organizations were left to fill the many welfare and health gaps, which they did by appealing for funds to help children. Then, as now, children were centrally positioned in fundraising campaigns designed to solicit financial support for organizations dedicated to improving children's lives and providing them with better opportunities. Yet the ways in which children were positioned to see themselves as people who could and should help, in whatever forms that assistance might take, are crucial to understanding how children and childhood were conceptualized in the past. Children were undoubtedly important contributors to charitable causes. Frank Prochaska observes that the financial contributions of children can be found in virtually every type of 19th century charity. Children accompanied their mothers often as they performed charitable work, and children's charitable activity was enormous in foreign and home missions, temperance societies, animal protection efforts, and Bible missions, to name just a few. Children's magazines were one of the main ways in which charitable causes were presented to young people. Many children's magazines can be understood as charity magazines. Most charitable organizations in the 19th century created publications aimed at adult supporters as a vehicle for defining their charitable cause, organizing its mostly volunteer workforce, and acknowledging contributions. As children in the 19th century were increasingly seen as a legitimate source of charitable support, these adult publications began to include content aimed at younger readers. Then, as sort of the amount of children's content increased, and the adults were like, there's too much children's content, we need to do something about this, a children's magazine was often established to separate the contents and clearly delineate its objectives for younger members. So the Wesleyans accordingly began publishing the Wesleyan Juvenile Offering, a miscellany of missionary information for young persons, rather than including the content in their adult missionary magazine, the Wesleyan Methodist Magazine. Similarly, Bernardo's Young Helpers League magazine emerged from his Night and Day. So these are I just kind of really want to emphasize, these are charity magazines that are developed for charitable causes quite specifically. And I'm using the missionaries as a charitable cause sort of in a very broad sense. Of course, it had other objectives there, but really very focused on what the mission of the charity was. And in contrast, there are other kinds of magazines that also included charitable objectives, but they weren't specifically oriented around that charitable objective. And that's my next slide. The ubiquity of charity in the 19th century means that charitable work was also encouraged in non-charity children's magazines. So we have Samuel Beaton's Boys' Own magazine, which raised funds in support of a drinking fountain. Edwin Brett's Boys of England encouraged boys to contribute funds to the magazine's Lifeboat Fund, raising £350 for the Southend's, and I've probably mispronounced that, first lifeboat. Readers of Good Words for the Young were encouraged to support children affected by the 1877 famine in India. And Judy's magazine, that I'll discuss a bit more in detail, provided significant support for the Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children. The Girls' Own paper supported the Princess Louise Home through fundraising and bazaars. The variety of magazines and charitable interests reflect the dynamic nature of charity and children's print during this period. Any magazine intended for young readers would likely include some requests for charitable work. The difference from those charity magazines is that the charitable focus was one of just many interests that were embedded into the magazine content. Understanding the real impact of these charitable campaigns on children is difficult to ascertain. A portion of children's financial contributions undoubtedly came from parents or other adults. Despite many charities strongly urging to make sacrifices, as Cyril did in the story from the Band of Hope Review with which this paper began, children's actual motivations and behaviors are not always or even often visible. Nonetheless, drawing on the sociology of childhood, I understand the child as a social actor who can participate in the world. Evidence of children's charitable participation is promoted and displayed in the pages of children's magazines and elsewhere. Children were actively encouraged in supporting these causes, which is important because participation in these and other democratic events was not clear-cut or naturally occurring. It's something that had to be solicited, encouraged, guided, and directed. The mechanisms that produce charitable behaviors can be difficult to pin down, since this behavior was motivated by multiple factors, both internal and external. Does a child decide to donate money to a charitable cause because they are distressed about ill children and believe that their donation will help? Or because they will derive some benefit, recognition, status, satisfaction from it? C. Daniel Batson explains that proponents of universal egoism claim that everything we do, no matter how noble and beneficial to others, is really directed towards the ultimate goal of self-benefit. While advocates of altruism do not deny the egoistic motivation, they claim that at least some of us, to some degree, under some circumstances, are capable of a motivation with an ultimate goal of benefiting someone else. The extent to which children's work for and contributions to a particular charitable cause can be attributed to egoistic or altruistic motivations is unclear. Even a seemingly altruistic act may result in forms of self-benefit. Earlier, I discussed how charity permeated the social fabric of Victorian England. Kidd explains how the utilitarian concepts of self-interest are only part of a larger picture of understanding charitable acts, since, he says, choices are made in a social, political, cultural, and ethical context in which voluntary cooperative behavior, including charity, cannot be rationalized as a mechanism of self-interest without the intervention of an internalized social ethic to impel voluntary action. This internalized social ethic is crucial to understanding how children saw themselves as people who should help others. Through their magazines, young readers were informed about the value and importance of charitable work. Because philanthropy was so thoroughly embedded in social and material conditions, the question of motive is relevant for the ways it restates the concerns of 19th century writers who engaged the relation between self-interest and sympathy as they shaped the representation of philanthropy for observers and participants. The multiple representations of charity that appear in text for young people are both helping to shape and are shaped by the charitable field. In the remainder of the paper, I draw on two examples related to charity to demonstrate how children and their magazines were operating during this period. In the first, discussing Aunt Judy's magazine, I want to explore how children's magazines produced charitable publics through their pages. And in the second, about the Barnardo's charity, I want to show how children were motivated to make these acts of charity. So beginning with the Aunt Judy's magazine example, I want to situate this charitable work as part of what I'm calling a charitable public. And I argue that the success of these periodicals in shaping children's attitudes towards their charitable cause is enabled through the charitable publics that are created through print. Drawing on Lauren Berlant's idea of intimate publics, I consider how charitable publics were defined and reinforced in children's periodicals to produce charitable children who understood their responsibilities to help others. Berlant uses women's consumer culture to form the basis of her exploration of what she calls intimate publics. As she explains in the preface, what makes a public sphere intimate is an expectation that the consumers of its particular stuff already share a worldview and emotional knowledge that they have derived from a broadly common historical experience. In children's periodicals, given the young age of the implied readership, the magazine is constituting the worldview and emotional knowledge that produces charitable giving, while also sharing contemporary social and cultural expectations about such giving, informed by religious beliefs that encourage care for others. The charitable public being created through the experience of reading the magazine alongside many other readers generates the shared expectation that this public will create a better experience of social belonging through the experiences of reading the magazine and contributing towards its charitable aims. Like Benedict Anderson's argument that the press created an imagined community, enabling the development and spread of nationalism, this charitable public flourishes as an effective site of identification among strangers that promises a certain experience of belonging and provides a complex of consolidation, confirmation, discipline, and discussion about enacting charitable behaviors. So the campaign in Aunt Judy's magazine to support the Great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children began in 1868. And it marks a significant shift in the language associated with children's charity, in which child health, rather than religious conversion, becomes most important. While the child's health was also entwined with ideas of class, these campaigns nonetheless reflected a distinct move away from religious charity that really kind of characterizes the period between about 1840 and sort of the mid-1860s. So Aunt Judy's magazine is one of some other examples that contains campaigns that nonetheless reflect a move away from religious charity to a more humanist rationale and rhetoric. So because this is not a religious magazine, we don't have the same kind of missionary, religiously inflected terminology that's being deployed, although it's sort of an undertone. So this was a six-penny monthly that had no explicit religious affiliation. It was published by a commercial publisher, George Bell, and it was aimed at both boys and girls. It was edited by Margaret Gatty, who was a natural historian and also a writer. And in her role as Aunt Judy, she introduces the hospital as a source of charitable contributions in the correspondence section of the January 1868 issue by including a letter from Samuel Whitford, the hospital's secretary. He explains and that's the little arrow there is the salient bit of the correspondence that's being included from Whitford. He explains the hospital's current plans to open a country branch of the hospital and wonders whether the readers of your highly interesting and instructive magazine might not be induced to contribute for the support of a cot, to be called the Aunt Judy's Magazine Cot. He explains that £30 will be sufficient to fund the cot for a year, and he sort of commits to sending regular reports about the children who are treated. Gadian concludes by explaining that Aunt Judy will be proud indeed if any of the supporters of her magazine feel disposed to assist towards the establishment of the Aunt Judy's Magazine cot. She promises to acknowledge every donation, however trifling, and will make an announcement once the required sum has been collected. She notes that donations need not be large to be acceptable. She would like every child with a kind heart and a would if they could feeling to believe that mites run up to sovereigns, where there are a good many willing hands to throw them into the same treasury. All children could and should raise money for the hospital, and their contributions would be published in the subscription lists in the magazine's correspondence section. In this case, the charitable public in support of the Great Ormond Street Hospital is created through a specific call to action for child readers, in which Gatti presumes that children will be interested in and able to support the cause. The charitable cause itself was generally supported through other content appearing elsewhere in the magazine. The initial request in the correspondence section that readers support the Aunt Judy's Magazine cot, for instance, was accompanied by an article in the same issue on the hospital for sick children. Gwynfryn, the pseudonym of Dorothea Jones, describes the hospital, which contains little people in very small beds ranged along the walls. The article concludes with the story of a desperately ill child who sends gifts to the hospital so that some of the poor children can play with her toys. The article and the concluding anecdote about a child contributor to the hospital introduce child readers, to the charitable cause and to the idea that they could help sick children through their contributions. When the idea is formally introduced at the end of the magazine in the correspondence section, readers would have already been exposed to the hospital and predisposed to see it as a cause worth supporting. Even after the charity was well understood within Aunt Judy's magazine, the magazine continued to offer other material beyond the specific updates about the cot to encourage readers to contribute. In Annie's Little Christmas, an illustrated poem appearing in November of 1871, the eponymous protagonist lies alone, ill, and in pain on a ragged bed. There, the image on the right-hand side is her lying in the bed. The poem begins by describing the sweet chimes of Christmas Day that are heard by many, but not those in the dark town where crowded dwell the poor in narrow courts and streets, like those where Annie lives. Her bed lies on the floor with a broken chair and a window in the background. Happily, the little sufferer is visited by Margaret, who also used to be unwell until she was treated at a children's hospital. Margaret describes the hospital as like heaven, with clean white beds, wholesome food, and relief from pain, where they taught her to read and to pray. The Great Ormond Street Hospital is named specifically, but the poem is not resolved with Annie being swept into its care. Instead, Margaret only hopes that Annie might also be able to be treated there. The image of the two girls together reflects the before and after of charitable giving. Margaret is grateful for the treatment she's received, while Annie's circumstances are desperately forlorn, even though she's hopeful that someone will eventually come and carry her away. In the final stanza, the narrator makes an appeal to readers to support the establishment of a new cot at the hospital. Shifting to directly address the reader, the narrator invites them to think of themselves as part of the charitable public by envisioning the many unfortunate children like Annie and asking whether they will let the suffering continue. Dear children, many Annies lie exhausted on their bed of pain. Oh, will you let their weary cry be uttered every day in vain? By little savings, could you not support a new Aunt Judy's cot? The concluding couplet, with its different rhyme scheme, calls on each child to save their money and support a new cot at the hospital. Supporting content like this poem and illustration reinforce the charitable cause that's discussed elsewhere in the magazine and help to produce its charitable public. And I just wanted to include this. This is not part of the magazine per se. It's an image of one of the children who was actually housed in the cot, and in the background, in that sign above the girl's head, it actually says Aunt Judy's Magazine Cot. And these were distributed to both the subscribers in Aunt Judy's Magazine and elsewhere, provided you paid 6 pence for a copy of the image, and we do see that at other places in the magazine. So there are some materials that are being produced sort of ancillary to the magazine that also kind of help, I think, create and reinforce this charitable public. And I thought people would like to see it, because I tell you, I was pretty excited when I came across that particular image. So the strategies of commercial magazines supporting a charitable cause are somewhat different from those of charity magazines, as I'll discuss in a minute. It may have been easier for commercial magazines to attract readers and obtain charitable donors, since the range of content meant that they could appeal to a wide audience, not only those who were presumably already interested in the charitable cause. Appeals like those appearing in Aunt Judy's Magazine offered an opportunity to attract readers to the cause if they were not already participating. In contrast, charity magazines had to attract new readers based on content falling within a much narrower range, informed by their charitable objectives. On the other hand, magazines with clear charitable objectives and appropriate materials for young people may have been more desirable to adult purchasers. The number of papers distributed for free, such as those handed out by missionary and temperance organizations, may have also influenced consumption habits among young readers. Aunt Judy's Magazine includes regular updates about the current cot inhabitant, to demonstrate the positive impact of the hospital. In Robert Frank's discussion of the motivations behind charitable giving, he explains that despite the importance of self-interested motives for most donors, a charitable organization's appeal for support must focus primarily on the worthiness of its cause. The first person to take up residence in the Aunt Judy's Magazine cot was a 10-year-old girl named Margaret, who was admitted for a hip complaint that required her to use a crutch. She's described in the cot report as follows. Margaret is 10 years old, has blue eyes and brown hair. Her father died 2 years ago, and her mother has since been obliged to work hard at such chance work as she can obtain during the winter in London, or in the country during the summer months at picking fruit, etc. There are 3 boys and 2 girls. 1 boy and 1 girl are in service. The 2 younger than Margaret sometimes go to school and sometimes help her to sweep a crossing near Russell Square. Soon after her father's death, Margaret had hip disease and was obliged to use a crutch at times too. After being accidentally run over by a cart, she was admitted to the university hospital. When discharged, some kind friends gained admission to her into this hospital, the children's hospital, this accident having developed the hip complaint. She is now very bright and happy, and having gone to school before her father died, can read, though not write. She likes learning hymns, and her latest editions are from Mrs. Alexander's Sweet Hymns for Little Children. Reports on Margaret and other cot inhabitants focus on how the child's circumstances have improved as a result of their time in hospital. Margaret is now bright and happy as a consequence of her treatment. Readers are later informed that some charitable women are seeking funding for her admittance to a longer-term house of relief, which they eventually secure in part through dedicated donations through the magazine. Over a year after the initial cot report appears, Aunt Judy's Magazine reports that Margaret is, quote, enjoying the comforts of a happy home at Miss Percival's institution and can now write as well as read. These kinds of cot reports have multiple functions in the pages of the magazine. Their regular appearance emphasizes the seriality, where readers might turn to the correspondence pages to check for updates about the current cot inhabited. Margaret Beetham explains that since the periodical depends on ensuring the readers continue to buy each number as it comes out, there is a tendency in the form not only to keep reproducing elements that have been successful, but also to link each number to the next. The cot reports provide a degree of continuity across the monthly issues to encourage readers to purchase the latest number, to situate the Aunt Judy's Magazine cot as the charitable cause supported by the magazine, and to promote an ideal of charity to its readers. The success of the charitable public produced through the magazine is evident in the names of contributors printed in each issue. In Aunt Judy's magazine, the subscription lists became an important feature of the magazine, providing evidence of the fundraising done by young readers. The magazine begins with, this is the very first subscription list circled in purple there. It's a fairly modest list. And this is the following month after the initial introduction of the cot as a charitable cause. So this is February 1868, and it indicates the range of different kinds of contributions from individual subscribers like Mrs. Fawcett, who commits to an annual subscription of £1, 1 shilling, to a collection of clothing from some little children in Yorkshire. The smallest monetary contributions are still relatively large at 1 shilling, but subsequent lists include smaller amounts of just 3 pennies. These lists of contributions appeared each month and are one of the main forms of content to reassert the importance of the charitable cause. Not only do they reward contributors who were able to see their names in print, but they also potentially attracted new contributors to become supporters of the cause. The public nature of these lists meant that readers looked to them as a record of their charitable work and expected them to be accurate. As Prochaska explains about women's charitable work in the 19th century, the long list of subscribers, which commonly took up the bulk of the annual charitable reports, were in themselves a sign of status seeking. The subscribers to Aunt Judy's magazine were clearly interested in the performative aspects of the list, contacting Gaddy when their names, locations, or contribution amounts were incorrectly identified. For instance, Gaddy reports that the poor woman at the mothers' meeting sent 1 shilling 9 pence instead of the 9 pence listed in February 1869. Similarly, Lucy, Ethel, May, and their mama are all from Wellingborough rather than Sittingbourne. Both errors were corrected in the following month. And the significance of this correspondence, I think, lies in the attention that subscribers paid to the printed list. Gaddy evidently agreed, promising to print the names of every contributor regardless of the size of contributions. The seriality of the subscription lists also promoted the charitable cause. Although some contributors were anonymous, each time a reader made a named contribution, they presumably wished to see their name and contribution in print and would turn to the latest issue of the magazine to see their donation and the gradually increasing balance. For commercial magazines like Aunt Judy's magazine, then, the subscription lists and the charitable cause more broadly served to retain readers and potentially attract new ones. These subscription lists were a vital feature of many 19th century magazines, helping to reinforce the charitable cause and ensure its success. Every issue of Aunt Judy's magazine after February of 1868 included a list of subscribers, and that was until it closed in 1885. And sometimes that list of subscribers extended across multiple pages. In addition, the Aunt Judy's magazine cot also inspired other named cots, and by 1877, there were 18 others across different magazines that had been funded. By 1885, 8 cots had been funded in perpetuity, and that's through Aunt Judy's magazine specifically, and that indicated that they'd raised £2,000 for each cot. So, I mean, really quite an astonishing charitable set of charitable revenue that had been raised through the magazine. And then there were a further 26 cots through life donations and 13 through annual subscriptions. Although Aunt Judy's magazine may have been the first to fund a named cot in a hospital, other magazines evidently felt this was an opportunity to attract new readers and signal their charitable ethos. Advertising and reviews of Aunt Judy's magazine occasionally highlight the vibrancy of those lists. The Perspectives for 1871 explains that a feature which has been found to have an unlooked for interest is the subscription list of Aunt Judy's magazine, which is kept up entirely by the subscribers to the magazine. In one of its regular reviews, The Spectator reports in 1879 how the magazine does one great practical work. it supports 2 cots at the Children's Hospital and collects for it both in money and goods, keeping its young donors fully informed of all it accomplished and carefully acknowledging all their kind presidents. The funding of the charitable cause plus the magazine's support through content like the COT reports indicate the importance of this material in attracting and maintaining readers and charitable contributors. Okay, so now the second part of my second case study, rather, is focusing on a charity magazine. So we'll be able to see a little bit how some of the differences in terms of those strategies. And I'll turn now to the Young Helpers League, which is operating sort of similarly to Aunt Judy's magazine, but with a much narrower focus on the Bernardo's charity. Thomas Bernardo founded his charity in 1868 with the establishment of the East End Juvenile Mission and the purchase of Stepney Causeway, a building intended to house destitute boys until employment or foster homes were secured. Although admission to the home was initially limited, the tragic death of Carrots, a young boy who had been denied entrance and was later found dead from exposure, prompted a new policy in which no destitute child ever refused. It took over 2 decades. So he started this charity in 1868, but it took over 2 decades for Bernardo to begin specifically capitalizing on the potential of young people to assist with the organization's fundraising by developing a charitable infrastructure. And to a certain extent, this really surprises me because Bernardo was a just really effective advertiser for his charitable cause. And it surprised me that he didn't engage with young people earlier, given that we have examples like Aunt Judy's magazine and so many others. I feel like he was kind of late in the game, and that's a little bit unexpected. But in 1891, he launched the Young Helpers League to encourage children to learn about and support Bernardo's charitable efforts. The first image on the left-hand side is from the end paper, and it sort of describes the intent of the league. To give definiteness to the work of the league, the end paper explains, members would support cots in Her Majesty's Hospital for Waif Children or the Home of Little Incurables. Each group of children called a habitation would be required to raise the annual amount, or rather, when they were able to raise the annual amount, they would be allocated a cot, which would be named after this group of children in their habitation. And then companions were permitted to visit the cot in the afternoon of any day. And Bernardo thus sort of establishes a specific achievable financial goal for the young people joining a habitation that's clearly identified from the very outset. That the children sought to meet this goal is unsurprising, I think, particularly in a charitable magazine like this. Yet it also raises question about how the magazine content furthered its goal. The middle image is the form that the children were required to submit, along with a 1 shilling subscription fee. So we can see here how the charitable infrastructure is much more established with clearly defined charitable objectives, this sort of this habitation organizational structure. The image of there's a little medal there on the little ring in the sort of the middle of the middle image. And that was the badge that you received if you attracted 12 new members. And then you obviously also need to submit your application form. So basically they're building a list of these charitable contributors, right? Which is quite different from what we saw in Aunt Judy's magazine, which is fairly ad hoc. If you wanted to send in money, you could send in money, but there was no kind of infrastructure associated with it. And then the final image on the right is a list of the names of the new habitations, the lodges, which were the organization kind of within it. 12 kids got together, became a lodge, 2 lodges formed to become a habitation. So depending how big your little group of children was, you could have different sort of parts of the infrastructure. But you needed a habitation level group in order to be able to sponsor a cot. But they're also, importantly, naming every single child who has submitted the 1 shilling to become a member of the association, and that had to happen each year, right? So there's the financial demand was, the minimum financial demand was much higher for the Young Helpers League, and it required, you know, a more explicit commitment to the charitable cause. Whereas in Aunt Judy's magazine, it could really just be kind of ad hoc. If you had the money, you could send it, but if you didn't, it was okay, right? So a really different kind of structure. And so all of this highlights the way that the charitable infrastructure was established and promoted within the magazine to help guide young readers to become part of the charitable public. And so I sort of in the last part here, I just want to think about the narrative and editorial strategies in the Young Helpers League magazine and how they deployed emotion to depict poor young children in need, thereby encouraging the middle-class child readers to help others and produce an emotional and effective response that was designed and expected to be translated into action by either directly assisting others or more often resulting in fundraising that would help others. Emotion is an important aspect of this serialized story, which began in the first issue of the Young Helpers League magazine. In Waif and His Friends, so this is actually, it's called the Waif and His Friends by one of them, but it's actually a Bernardo authored story. He employs the allegorical character names of Waif, Sister, and Scavenger to relate the story of a poor boy living on the streets, the nursing sister who cares for him, and Bernardo himself, who scavenges the streets for poor children in need of assistance. The description of Waif is designed to produce a feeling of pity. This poor boy has a very big head, but his body is very small with a lump on his back. One leg is crooked and much shorter than the other. Waif is pitiable, which the reader learns as Bernardo explains how other folks, if they looked at Waif more closely, wanted to cry. The invisibility of people like Waif on the streets of London mean that they often go unnoticed and uncared for. The narrator remarks that it is perhaps not surprising that Waif grew thinner and thinner, and his eyes sadder and sadder. Not only do others feel sorry for Waif, but he too is saddened by his wretched circumstances. The story suggests no other reading than pity and dismay over poor Waif. This pitiful situation is juxtaposed to the positive emotions generated when Scavenger trips over Waif, gives him sixpence, and invites him to the home in Stepney Causeway for some dinner by the fire. The possibilities of the sixpence brings tears to Waif's eyes, and his feelings of cold and hunger are temporarily banished, for it seemed as if the sun had shone out. When Waif discovers the coin's actually half a crown instead, he decides he has to return it so that Scavenger knows he's not a thief. The honesty and integrity of Waif shine through in this interaction as he forsakes self-interest by refusing to accept the coin as a boon and instead insists on returning it to its owner. This produces a set of circumstances that are manifestly an improving set of circumstances for Waif, and that's designed to produce positive emotions in him, but also, I think more importantly, in the implied readers. The lovely scene in the hospital ward where he ends up with white beds and pretty pictures on the walls makes him forget his pain, and Sister smiles at him as she puts a cool hand on his forehead. Waif falls asleep with a reflection of the smile he received from her on his face, and as he recovers, readers are told that his frown would never again return. The tension of this story is resolved through Sister's tender care and the knowledge that Waif is now happy and content within the home. This hopeful conclusion provides an archetypal pattern of the main characters and the emotional register for this type of narrative. A downtrodden, unhappy Waif is saved from the dire circumstances of the street by the philanthropist and placed under the suitable, loving caregivers like Sister. These types of narratives were not always factually correct, but they contributed to the feelings of pity that Bernardo was hoping to produce among young readers. By telling a particular kind of story about the waif in need of charitable assistance, Bernardo could hope to inspire his middle-class readers of a magazine that's explicitly created to support this charity, inspire those readers into feelings of pity in ways that were consistent with these ideas about social welfare, and encourage specific actions to help others. So this magazine started in 1891, and by about 1897, it starts to include color, which is a sort of exciting innovation in this general charitable field. These plates colorful plates reinforce the same sort of emotional language of the story, which is typically written to direct readers towards specific interpretations of the image and text pairings that reinforce both the privileged middle-class position of the implied reader and the need for Bernardo's and the reader's charitable efforts. So here we get some color, which is kind of nice. And in a story called Houseless and Homeless, this appeared in 1902, this story interpolates the implied reader into the emotion of need and the reality of charitable giving. The story begins with the word evicted, and the imagined reader wondering about the meaning of the word. According to the narrator, it has nothing to do with any part of your life. The only place you are likely to learn of it is in the dictionary. The middle-class reader will never know anything about being evicted from their home, so the narrator invites them to please look at the illustration. I lost my bit. Yes, right. And sorry, and directs them to see the chain and padlock on the door where once that little family lived. The few things that helped to make the house a home have been bundled out onto the pavement, and the illustration depicts the small number of belongings sitting on the street. The mother, looking haggard, holds the youngest child while two older children stand around her. Only the father is criticized. He is, quote, not worthy of the name, as he has deserted the family. Since poverty was increasingly read as a moral failure, the reader's encouraged to search for the moral failings and vices to which this suffering might be attributed. Blame is attributed to the father, as the mother is homeless through no fault of her own and is now an outcast on the weary streets of dreary London. The intent of the story and the illustration is not solely to depict such sad cases of destitution and misery. Bernardo explains that it would have been heartless to produce this picture merely to explain the meaning of eviction, and then he invites readers to consider the question of why it has been included. His answer, in order to show the value of applied sympathy, informs readers of the meaning that they are supposed to take away. On discovering the eldest boy begging, an image of which is inset into the larger illustration, Bernardo found that the mother could just manage to support herself if he was able to take the three children. So what else could he do but increase the largest family in the world by 3? The story is resolved with Bernardo posing yet another rhetorical question. Is it not satisfactory to know that Bernardo, is enabled to do the right thing at the right time? The reader is reminded that without friends such as the Young Helpers League companions, this assistance would not be possible. Thus, the dismay and sadness are transformed in the narrative to satisfaction about doing the right thing. It may be Bernardo himself who discovered and saved the family, but this action is enabled by the contributions made by the League. We have a similar kind of story here in the Gordon Ward. Her Majesty's Hospital includes an accompanying illustration depicting poor children who are currently patients in the hospital. Here we have Jimmy sitting up in a bed with crisp white sheets. This is very common in case you haven't noticed. The beds are always nice and clean with crisp white sheets. With a book, there's tiny soldiers sitting on top of a book, lying on his lap, and there's a bird resting at his hand. On his hand. At the head of the bed is a sign reading the Young Helpers League Wellington cot. And the narrator once again uses second person address to ask, would you like to know Jimmy's story? Not long ago, the narrator continues, he was rescued from a poor home where he lay sick and ill and devoid of proper care and nursing. After he became a protege of the Young Helpers League, all this changed. Surrounded by love and tenderness, his pain and weakness lessened day by day. Jimmy is now as happy as the day is long with his return to health, and soon comes the glad day when he can dress and play about in the ward. In the illustration and in the story, the successes of the charity are explicitly stated. And even the caption of the illustration, What Our Young Leaguers Work For, situates this narrative as a goal for the charity, in which the poor and sick are transformed into healthy, happy children through the Young Helpers League support of the magazine. Okay, and my final example, I might just briefly mention what we do have here on the right-hand image of the page is the Cock Chronicle, and it's doing something quite similar to what Aunt Judy's magazine was doing, with providing these kind of regular updates of the children who are in the beds. It's just there are so many beds that they start numbering the cots and identifying which habitation is supporting them. So again, we've got that same sort of infrastructure in place where we're reporting on the success of the children in the beds. And then in my the final image, and then I'll wrap up, we have an example of how Alice helped, is the title of the story. And the illustration is a collage of 4 images, beginning in the top left with Alice Gray gesturing towards a poster for a Young Helpers League meeting announcing an address by Bernardo himself. The main image, with a rectangular border to make it stand out, is in the bottom left, and it features Alice at the bazaar she's helped organize as she sells a doll to a well-dressed woman. Extending across the top left corner is a string of coins to indicate the money raised by Alice through her participation in the Young Helpers League. On the bottom corner is a portion of a bank check in the amount of £10, 6 shillings and 3 pence written out to Bernardo. The accompanying story describes Alice's encounter with the Bernardo's charity as the beginning of her life work. She already had a desire to do some good for others, but had not yet found a particular outlet for her energies. The narrative depicts the transformation from sort of an emotional response to charitable activity that lies at the heart of this discussion. The money that Alice raises is destined to bring sunshine and happiness into the life of many a prisoner of pain. And it's designed to encourage others. Like some of the other stories appearing in the magazine, this one also includes a call to action question. The author Clarissa asks, does not Alice's example inspire you to go and do likewise? So this discussion has oscillated between the childhood models of charity embodied in fiction, editorials, informational articles, and illustrations, and the real children who discuss, debate, and enact charitable habits. The evidence of these latter children is apparent in their financial contributions, their correspondence, the reports of their hospital visits. Real children undertaking charitable work are evident in these magazines, and this evidence reflects their engagement with the charitable ideal promoted in their pages. The charitable child, then, is deployed in 2 distinct ways in children's magazines. First, this child is an object of charity, a figure mobilized through image and text to motivate young readers to take action to relieve suffering. Second, and even more saliently, this child is understood through the lens of benevolence as someone who could help others, who acknowledged that responsibility, and who responded to the call to action. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Kristine. That is a wonderful sort of panorama. Here we go. Well, a wonderful panorama of lots of things. I'm sure there'll be many questions among us as people consider what questions to indicate that they might ask in the chat. I might myself jump in if I could with a question to kick us off. It struck me, I don't know if it struck anyone else here, right from the beginning of your talk, how strange it felt to me to ask children directly for money in a charitable context. And my sense, at least, is that that doesn't really happen as much now in the same way. Like it sort of causes are presented to children, but without the, and please, could we have some of your money, children, now? And perhaps outside an institutional context like a school where there are trusted relationships, just sort of sending out a magazine asking children for money seems strange to me. And I guess part of my question is, does that also appear strange to you? And if so, do you know when it died out, when it became socially awkward, perhaps, to ask children directly for money? And the second part of my question relates to the common good idea and what sort of common good is being served by this. And of course, there are the children in the cots who are being helped as a result of this. But I wonder what your reflections are on the extent to which this sort of discourse is giving agency to children within society, saying you are not only the recipients of charity and aid, but you are potential and indeed actual givers. And that situates children really interestingly, I think, in society as agents and givers rather than just as receivers. Now, I wondered if you had any comments on that.
Well, those are excellent questions, Chris. The answer to the first one is really difficult and is sort of the subject of ongoing inquiries in my own mind, because the ideas that I talked about in relation to children's magazines are really common in children's periodicals, I would say, up until about the 1930s. And there's a whole bunch of things that are happening in relation to the shift in children's literature. But I'm really interested in how charity sort of starts to just disappear in the 20th century, because I've gone looking for the equivalent of the 19th century waif novels that have these poor, unfortunate children, and we just don't see the equivalent in the 20th century. So, at least not in the fiction that's being written sort of in the Anglo-American world. And it is really interesting to me that children are no longer kind of asked to contribute. And I think part of that is because we have more clearly established childhood as a space of innocence in need of protection in the 20th century. So that's clearly part of it. Because if a child is fully in that space, then we can't actually suggest to them that there are other children who might be in need, right? Because then how do we define this protected space? So I think part of it is we don't want to maybe psychically damage children by telling them that the world isn't as we're kind of protecting them to think it is. And I have a bit of a guess almost that some of the charitable work that we see in the 21st century that we can still ask children to do, I think, is in relation to the environment. I think, care for the environment strikes me as being the thing that we now want children to do. And it doesn't necessarily require them to have money to be able to do that. So this is all very speculative at this point, but I do think that that's part of the shift, is that we in the 20th century, we can just no longer sort of point out these children that are not as well off and who need assistance, and we can't ask children for money because they're pretending they don't have any money, is sort of part of the logic there. So I think there's just a whole bunch of things that are happening in the 20th and into the 21st century. But on the other hand, as a parent myself, I'm like, it is really interesting that we don't ask children to look beyond themselves, except I think in relation to the environment and perhaps animal welfare, but there are ways that we're protecting children in specific kinds of ways. And is that for the best? I don't know. I kind of, in certain ways, I love the 19th century because they really are demanding children to look beyond themselves and see how they might be able to help people. And I don't think that's a terrible thing. But anyway, there are so many questions, and I would welcome if anybody has other thoughts. The question about giving agency to the children who are recipients of charity is a really good one. And there are some interesting examples where children who are the recipients of charity are then specifically asked to donate because they have already been the recipients of charity. And so they have this really interesting kind of dual subject position where they are simultaneously needing to be the deserving recipients of charitable work, as well as demonstrating that they are good charitable donors, which I think is a really complex position to be in. There's actually quite a fabulous example. The Bernardo's charity in addition to taking, because they have this policy that they would accept all of the children, they then had a problem because they couldn't actually accept all of the children, right? They needed to do something with them. And so what they started to do is they started immigrating them to Canada. And this was basically from about 1880 on till it ceased in Canada in 1927. And so they would send children over for £10. Effectively, you could send a child to Canada. They would then be housed either on farms, or if you were a boy working on a farm, or girls in domestic servants. And then Bernardo's, they set up a magazine, of course they did, to to encourage these recipients of charity to also contribute £1 a year, basically, to that would go towards immigrating yet further children out to Canada. So, and they, Bernardo's is like, where's the money that you kind of notionally agreed you would repay as part of your immigration? And I think the children were a little recalcitrant in some ways, kind of potentially depending on how good their experience was. There were some children who really had a fabulous time. Like, it was clearly for them a really great opportunity to have gone to Canada. They, some of the boys in particular, were housed on really great farms and created a really loving relationship. And then, were inheriting farms or saving enough money that they were able to go out and purchase their own. And I think depending on whether or not that was good for them, they were more willing to donate their money. And then if it wasn't a very good experience, I mean, you never see any of that kind of correspondence appearing in the magazine, because of course, they only wanted to print the good letters. But yeah, I suspect that some of them were just like, I'm definitely not going to donate to your charity because I don't really think this was very good for me.
Oh, that's
So
fantastic.
yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Rena has a couple of fascinating comments here in the chat. I wonder if you wouldn't mind voicing them for the people watching the video afterwards, Rena. Oh, I think
You're
you may be
muted.
on mute. You may be on mute.
No, still
Oh,
muted. Can we fix that, Chris? Maybe we just
I can't. Here we go. We're unmuted now.
Great. Try again, Rena.
Do you want me to talk?
Yes.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. You two fascinating comments in the chat, and it would be wonderful if you would be able to voice them for the people watching the video afterwards who can't read the chat. Oh, you've muted again. I'm so sorry. I am unable to unmute you manually.
Maybe I could read out what's in the chat. How about that?
Let's do that. That's a very good solution, Kristine. Thank you.
Okay. So Rita says the Depression years would have made it harder for children to have pocket money. Yes, I think that's quite true. I also think that by the time the Depression hit, there were fewer. We were already beginning to see the decline of these kind of charitable themes appearing in the magazines, because by the 1930s, the magazines look quite different from the ones that I've talked about today. And then she says, in the 1950s, there were regular flag days with voluntary collectors on the streets in shopping areas to capture the odd pennies in exchange for a flag or a sticker on the lapel, so you wouldn't be accosted again. It's true. You get your little flag and you put it on, and then you're good to go. I mean, these sorts of flag days probably have their links to Empire Days, and there were numbers of children's celebrations for Empire Days and so on that were kind of promoting the Empire, or then Australia Day and that sort of thing. They're interesting. They're a very different kind of form, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, say something.
Poppies for the Remembrance Day in November,
Yeah.
11th of November. So always poppies on the street.
Absolutely.
I'm writing another one, but I can tell you much more quickly. I've interviewed a woman whose grandfather and great uncle were brothers, and they were apparently she thought, in the first contingent of Dr. Bernardo's boys who came out at the turn of the century, in between 1900 and 1920, to work in Newcastle in the coal mines. Oh, I know. I went, oh. And I immediately tried to find more detail, but I'm not near enough to the archives. There would be New South Wales archives for that stuff. But anyway,
I mean,
yes.
that's really interesting. As I've presented some of this research in various sort of Antipodean locales, I've had a few kind of interesting comments about somebody in New Zealand, I think, said that they were still collecting for Bernardos at school in the sort of 1940s and 1950s. So that was really interesting to me. And the Bernardos boys actually went on tour. There were two different trips that Bernardo boys took in the early 1900s to Australia and New Zealand, and they would do performances, like they were playing some instruments and that sort of thing. And I think, that was designed as a promotional tour in which the children were demonstrating that they were, good recipients of charity that were circulating through the empire, so that Bernardo's could continue to raise money from its.
They were singing for their supper.
Yeah, very much so. But it works, because I've got all these really great examples from the New Zealand press where the children were going to visit the Bernardo boys like this, and then they were saving money and donating their money that way. So it's kind of interesting. Some of these ones, though, that are on the street, the children then are more of a kind of a byproduct of that charitable work. They weren't really the intent, right? Mom or dad might buy you a poppy and then you'd get one, but it was, I think, operating a little bit differently. What's particularly interesting for me in relation to the magazines is just how targeted the young people were as the purveyors of charitable good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rena, for that really rich exchange. I wonder if I could invite Deborah, please, to ask your question.
Hopefully, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Sure can.
Yay. Thanks so much, Chris. I'm not sure if you've already read the little chat question, but I'm always curious about the illustrations, and you were talking a little bit about the way that affect is invited in the illustrations, the kind of pitying the waif or the destitute family. And then we had the image of the white child in the crisp white sheets. And I kept thinking, is there going to be an illustration of, the happy child post receiving the charity, in the streets playing? I think as far as they get is the bed. And then when you showed that last illustration, I thought, oh, that's different. Is that what they look like happily ever after? And like, no, those are the people who are giving to the children. So anyway, yeah, just curious if there is any invitation to feel, I don't know, joy for the, now healthy child.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. There's a couple of really interesting examples in the Junior Red Cross magazine. So the Junior Red Cross magazines, they all started in the 20th century, and one of they had a motto of which service was one of their key values. And so they would raise money. I'm thinking particularly of the Junior Red Cross in Canada. They would raise money to send children who basically lived in parts of the country that didn't have good medical care, but who needed operations. They would raise money to be able to send poor little Johnny to the hospital so that he could have his surgery. And there is a before and after of poor Johnny with his misshapen leg, and then poor Johnny with his now straightened, fixed body, and how he's now going to be able to go and play with all of the other kids. So there's something interesting happening there, of course, in relation to the normative body, right? There's not a lot of acceptance of disability insofar as anything that is a problem needs to be resolved medically, right? There's not a lot of kind of social models of disability or anything like that. So we have lots of images of the child in the bed, because that was, of course, the first kind of point of care, I guess. But there are enough examples of, oh, and now poor little Margaret is, now she's out in the country and she's able to play in the woods. There's lots of connections between improving health through nature, and getting away from the urban centers that have, in a lot of cases, are seen as the cause for the ill health, combined with inadequate parenting, or not being able to kind of support the child the way they need to. So there certainly is a sense that if you, the child donor, can give your money, that other child who's going to be helped will end up somewhere playing and being a much happier child than their current circumstances will enable. I would probably say that doesn't tend to show up in the illustrations very much, because the illustrations, because they're designed to produce the affect to generate the charitable work, you don't need to see the happy child at the end as much as you need to see I think at least that was their logic. Yes, we have to see the pain and the suffering, because that's what's going to motivate us to make the donation.
Great, thank you.
Good question.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Michelle.
Hi, Chris. That reminded me a little bit of Sponsor a Child ads in 80s and 90s, or you would see the children who were kind of starving, and, that was the call to action, wasn't it? Because how can you ignore this, horrible situation? But my question is coming off, I guess, some of the thinking around changes to charity in childhood, because I was just thinking the things that exist today are sort of a lot of organization based, like school sends your kid home with chocolates to raise money for the school, or scouts raise money for their activities, or Surf Life Saving Club kids are out rattling the tins, and often it's to benefit, I guess, their own organizations or endeavors within the school or within those community groups. So I was wondering two things. One, what happened to lessen the role of magazines as a catalyst for organizing and shaping a community? Because I don't think we look to them, or even when print was still sort of happening maybe 20 years ago, we maybe wouldn't have looked to them to mobilize children in the same way as these community groups do. And the second part is, what do you think of that shift from charity that kind of helps the group you're part of, rather than the group of children who are less privileged? Because clearly that's a very different thing. Like, let's make our school better versus look at these children who don't even have a school or have water or whatever it might be.
Yes. Oh, those are unexpectedly, or rather not unexpectedly, those are kind of tough questions, Michelle. So thank you so much for that. So why do I think magazines have declined in the 20th century as a catalyst for charity? Okay. And thanks. I mean, we're actually friends. You wouldn't know it. So
easy ones already. We've got to get tough here, Chris.
Yeah, fair. Well, I suppose I guess I would start by saying that magazines in the 19th century were the main form of culture that children were consuming, both in terms of the books that they were able to access, and then, I mean, magazines were available to a much wider group of young people because they were much less expensive than books. As we turn to the 20th century, and as the 20th century progresses, of course, there's a wider range of cultural forms that children are consuming, beginning with radio and then into TV. And I guess that really, I should have done more thinking about this, and perhaps there are people in the audience who might have other things to contribute to this. But I think the magazine there still absolutely were and are magazines for young people, but I think as a percentage of the culture that young people are consuming the magazine is much smaller. There still are some really kind of quite vibrant magazines, like National Geographic has a National Geographic Kids magazine, and I think they are being encouraged to think about how they can support the sort of environmental change and climate crisis and that sort of thing, but in maybe not as explicit charitable kinds of ways. So I think the magazine is suffering from the range of different forms that it's competing against. And the shift to the focus on the self I think it's a really interesting point that you raise. And certainly it would reflect my own sort of sense of the kinds of things that children are being asked to do. And I mean, some of that is around the exoticization of the children who need to be helped, and just the ways in which the whole idea around white saviors sweeping in to solve that problem is much more problematic in a lot of very legitimate kinds of ways, right? So it becomes easier, I suppose, in certain ways to just say, well, what are things that we can do for our own community, and sort of to kind of stay focused on those, rather than this sort of, oh, you need help, so we'll raise money and we'll go help you. Because I just think we're more thoughtful now about how we are doing charity, and the ways in which others coming through and saying this is the solution to that problem is not maybe as ideal. And in the 19th century, they largely weren't thinking about any of those sorts of things, right? It was like, yes, we will sweep that child up and we will take care of them in the hospital, and then we will put them in a home out in the countryside. And the poor working class family that's sort of just been totally upended because Bernardo sweeps through and decides that your child would be better in immigrated to Canada, no less. I mean, Bernardo's was pretty shocking, I think, in a number of the ways that he severed family connections and then sent children to Canada and then lied to them about the fact that they weren't orphans. So I think in certain ways we've become more careful about the kinds of charity that we do in general, and obviously that relates then to the kind of things we might ask young people to do.
Wonderful. Michelle, do you have a devilishly difficult follow-up to your very hard question?
What?
No, I don't, but I think Stephanie has a comment.
She does indeed. She did. I just wanted to make sure that you were.
No, I was very
Well,
satisfied.
Very pleased to hear it. In that case, Stephanie, please do go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much for this really interesting talk. One thing that struck me as really interesting are the list of contributors or subscribers that are present in these magazines. And one sort of way I was looking at it is, I'm sure that these lists serve multiple functions, one of which might be to inspire pride in, the efforts of the contributors. And but also it seems like as it serves a social function in terms of social recognition of such contributors. So I was just wondering, kind of vaguely, if the magazines had any specific agenda in terms of promoting charitable work through either feelings of pride in one's altruism, through, as you were saying, they tried to inspire feelings of pity, which would motivate such altruism, or if they were trying to also sort of play on this, creating the characterization of charitable persons being recognized and sort of celebrated for their work.
So thanks very much. That's an interesting question. I think there's a couple of different things I would have to say in response to that. One is that the missionary magazines in particular tended to collect all of the donations together and then only report them sort of at the level of the Sunday school. So they didn't list those individual contributions. That changed by the end of the century. But at the beginning of the century, it was, well, in the 1840s, which is when the first magazines start to appear, they tended to do it as collections, which I thought was really interesting because it was actually sort of going against what I was seeing elsewhere, in which, yes, it was the individual contributions that we were seeing and that were being published. So I thought it was quite consistent, perhaps, with the sort of the religious ethos, that it wasn't about the specific individual donations as much as we can all work together to do something, and we don't need individual recognition for that. However, by the end of the century, the same Wesleyans that were just noting everything sort of at the collection level were starting to promote, if you, in the first instance, if you raise more than £2, they would print your picture in the magazine. And that lasted for about a year, and too many people could collect £2. So then they kept raising the minimum threshold to get your photo in the paper, which it was just sort of the editorials that accompanied it sort of just talk about how overwhelming it was to try and manage, because people would send in their £2 plus their photo, and then it needed to be published, and then they were creating an index so that children could go and find their, like, what page their picture, like, it was just all quite a thing. And that was really fascinating to sort of look at that 60-year period and see how that sort of collectivity, that this is just something we should all be doing and we don't really need individual acknowledgement for it, had shifted so much by the end of the century, in combination with how the technology had shifted as well, so that we could actually really, more children had access to photos, and then we could easily reproduce them in the magazine. And so therefore we would do that to really kind of highlight the children who had done sort of extraordinary amounts of work to support the charitable cause, but then apparently not that extraordinary. So like the next year it went up to £3, and then it went up to £4, and you could just see how logistically it was actually becoming quite complicated to manage. Does that kind of begin to explore some of the things that you're asking?
Yeah, absolutely. That's super interesting, that shift. So thank you so much.
Cool.
Wonderful. I wonder if I could ask Alma now. I think you had a question, Alma.
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you for this fascinating talk, Kristine. So yeah, my question is about what sort of explanations the children were given, to be convinced to donate their money. Like, you chip in, you donate to be a good person. What is a good person? Why should I give my money? Like, in these magazines, what kind of values were the children like exposed to? This altruism, or the reason why? Because I imagine, if I were a child and I was asked to donate my money, my very precious pocket money, I would want to know, why should I do that in the first place? And is it for what kind of good? Okay, so what? I donate my money. So what happens to the society? Okay, why should I even care that other children live, in bad conditions? So basically, my question is, were these discussed in those children magazines to the children?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting question, because to a certain extent, what's most surprising about these magazines is actually the fact that they they don't have the conversation in the same way as you've just raised it, right? I think because there is this underlying Christian ethos, there is a sense that you should help others, you should do unto others, right? And the way that that is produced for the young people is by giving us a series, like so many examples of other children who are at a disadvantage, who are unhealthy, who are uncared for, who are poor, who don't have enough food, who are dirty, who are cold, who are tired, right? So it's a set of sort of circumstances. And I think, I mean, by and large, the majority of the charitable causes that children are asked to contribute to are always for other children. So it's I think their charitable impulse is mobilized based on an assumption that children will help other children because they can identify with those other children that don't have parents, that don't have a place to live, and that sort of thing. And there is just this underlying assumption that of course you should help because you can. And so it's less about the what is this going to do for me and how will make it will make the world better, as much as I can help poor Margaret who's in hospital with a bad hip, and she will be better and she will be like me. There's one fabulous story. Honestly, right now I can't remember what magazine it's from, but basically a child writes into a magazine and says, George is in the cot. It might be in Aunt Judy's. So George writes into Aunt Judy's magazine and says, George, there's another George who's in the Aunt Judy's magazine cot right now. And his name is George, and my name is George, and I'm going to help the other George. So I think in certain ways that connection, but child to child, is really what is being mobilized. So there's not sort of that same big picture, what benefit is this going to provide? Could my money go better elsewhere? I mean, in the 19th century, children are only beginning to be seen as consumers, kind of in the way that we understand consumers now. So, you know, they're increasingly having a little bit of pocket money, but a lot of the ways that we think about children in the 20th and 21st century haven't really completely finally emerged yet. And so there is a different, I think, maybe a slightly different kind of understanding of children and their economic contribution, particularly amongst the implied readers of the magazines that I'm mostly looking at, which were generally middle class. And so it was really just I should help that other child because that other child needs help.
Great, thank you.
It's a good question. Thank you.
Debbie, you had a fascinating comment in the chat here. I wonder if you'd be able to share it.
Oh, I was just busy reading all of the backgrounds while you were talking, Chris, and one of the slogans, I think it was probably on the Bernardo, was that, yeah, bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. I just thought such a command, and that it's, you know, yeah, based on a kind of Christian ideology, but also kind of the guilt, right? Like, I better do this or else I'm gonna, you know, mess with Christ. I don't know, maybe that's just my own child coming forward.
Totally. And Bernardo's, he mobilized the language, and this shows up regularly in the ones that are explicitly Christian focused. This is a war. You are soldiers in the army. You know, and then the temperance magazines too. It's like this is, you are being called to battle in a certain way to do God's work. So I think, Deb, you're absolutely right to highlight that. And because Bernardus was evangelical as well, right? So it's got quite a specific orientation that yes, if you are good Christian children, you should take up responsibility to do the work to help others to improve their circumstances, and you should really not expect any reward for that. It's just what you do, right?
Yeah. Canadians.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much for that. really rich exchange. It's been an exceptionally rich session, this. I think everyone here will agree. We've been able really to explore these issues with breadth and depth, and it's all down to you, Kristine. So thank you for being so generous with your answers and so generous with your time. Thank you for leading us into this world, and please join with me in thanking Kristine Moruzi.
Thanks everybody for coming along. It was a really great conversation. I appreciate it.